today's video, we are going to cover 10 of the signs that you could be an autistic woman. If you like the video, please subscribe, please like the channel to be kept updated with new videos and different resources. One of the fundamental signs that you could have autism is that you experience social difficulties and social communication issues. So what are we talking about here? Well, social communication issues can take a sort of wide range of shapes. Often autistic people have difficulties connecting socially with others. They might have difficulties in relationships. Certainly doesn't mean that you want to be alone, that you don't want friends, but there can be difficulties sort of maintaining and making those friendships. Some autistic people have very fundamental communication issues. So it can be really difficult maybe to understand verbal communication, to get your point across, and to sort of know how to communicate effectively. Sometimes this comes across as not talking, finding it very difficult to speak up, that could be particularly in groups. You might find it very difficult to talk about things that you're not interested in. And some autistic people might find that they unintentionally offend other people or upset them because they can be very blunt and to the point. There are a whole host of social communication issues, which I will explore in more detail in a separate video. But this is one of the core symptoms of autism. So you may find that if you're experiencing real difficulties connecting, making friends, establishing contact, and communicating in the way that you want to communicate, that could be a potential sign of autism. Another sign that you could potentially be autistic is that you will experience the world at sensory level in a different way to most people. Now, we often think of sensory issues as being a sort of negative thing, but some autistic people have sensory seeking behaviours. If we think about a heightened sensitivity to sensory triggers, it could be that things like sounds or lights or particular textures really feel unbearable for you. So it's not about not liking something, it's about being not able to tolerate something. And this will be something that will have gone back to childhood. So if you have an extreme sort of sensory reaction to the world around you, potentially that could be a sign of autism. Another potential sign of autism is with what we call executive function issues. Now, executive function issues can again show up in a lot of different ways, but the easiest way I've found is to think of almost having a boss in your brain, a manager who organises all the other workers in your brain to get on with the things that they might need to do, whether that's completing a work project or getting the housework done. So there are things that need to be done, and some autistic people really struggle to coordinate what needs to be done. It's got nothing to do with laziness. There's a severe problem with task management and sort of getting on with maybe not the most interesting things in the world, but prioritizing things and getting through tasks. So that could be a potential sign of autism. A potential indicator of autism is having very, very intense interests. Sometimes these are called restricted interests. They could be called obsessive interests. Having interests is certainly not unusual, but when you have interests to the point that it's difficult to think about anything else, talk about anything else, perhaps all your friends have similar interests, and really it becomes the most important thing in your life, which might even have a detrimental effect. It might stop you sleeping, looking after yourself, socializing with other people. If you have interests at that level and you've always sort of had these types of interests for a long time, the interests themselves might change, but the level of interest is consistent. That could be a potential sign of autism. Another sign of autism, particularly in women, is that you camouflage to a high degree. So what does camouflage mean? Camouflaging means that you're aware that perhaps you have certain differences to most people. You find it difficult to socialize. You might find that you know that you communicate differently to most people, and you make a great effort to hide that. So camouflage can also be a sign of social anxiety, but autistic people might camouflage because in the past, maybe someone else has pointed out to them that they do things differently. So if you find yourself putting on an act, taking on a persona, trying to learn how to act socially, still feeling uncomfortable and trying to cover that up, potentially that could be a sign of autistic camouflaging. Another slightly less obvious symptom is sleep patterns. So autistic people often experience really, really bad sleep patterns. It could be due to sometimes underlying anxiety. Sometimes it's just waking up with a real sense of excitement about an interest, wanting to get on with an interest. Lots of reasons underlying bad sleep patterns, but it's something that often shows up when you're autistic. Another thing that you might want to think about is eye contact. So not all autistic people sort of have a lack of eye contact. Not all autistic people find it problematic, but an awful lot do. So when I'm working with clients, I would say more than 9 out of 10 of my clients really struggle with eye contact. It doesn't mean that they make, inverted commas, bad eye contact, because they might have learned to make really good eye contact as the result of a camouflaging technique, but it more often than not feels very, very uncomfortable for them. So if eye contact feels really horrible for you, and perhaps it's something that people have commented on in the past, that could potentially be a sign of autism. Another issue that many autistic women experience, many autistic people in general experience, is issues around emotional regulation. So if we think about emotional regulation in terms of being in touch with our emotions, in terms of being able to identify our emotions, maintain control when we want to maintain control, that might be regarded as healthy emotional regulation. Many autistic people, going right back to childhood, have a real difficulty controlling their emotions. They might experience very, very intense emotions and find it difficult to sort of remain in a situation. They might find themselves having what are often called meltdowns, very extreme responses, or becoming so shut off that they can't communicate with other people. And often autistic people describe their emotions as sort of being just below the surface. So if you've noticed that you respond emotionally in a different way to most people, if you find it hard to stay in control, potentially that could be a sign of autism. Another potential sign of autism is thinking about sort of repetitive behaviours and sameness. We can think about this in two ways. We can think about sort of doing something physical again and again, which we would call a repetitive motor behaviour, often called stimming, or we can think about needing things to be the same, having a strong need for routine, finding it really hard when things are disrupted, not being able to cope with change in plan, maybe doing the same set thing day after day, and really having a very strong response if that is changed or interfered with. Again, most people like a routine, but thinking of, is this unusual? Do I respond more intensely than most people? Is it harder for me to be adaptive and spontaneous and change? If the answers to that are yes, potentially that could be a sign of autism. Finally, autistic people are far more likely than the general population to have other mental health issues. So if we think about anxiety, depression, suicidality, self-harming, addiction, it's more likely that you will have some kind of mental health issue if you're autistic. And with autistic women, the level of eating disorders is far higher than it is in the general population. So although it's not limited to autistic women, if you do have mental health issues and all of the other symptoms that we've looked at, potentially they could be an indicator of autism. Now, it's really, really important not to jump to conclusions and think that even if you check off these 10 symptoms or traits that you're autistic, they could relate to something else. It's very important to really do your research, if possible, have some kind of official assessment to establish whether your symptoms and whether your traits are due to autism, whether they're due to something like ADHD, whether they're a trauma response, or whether they're just a part of your personality. We really need to sort of drill down a bit and get specific and look at the other information as well. But looking at these 10 symptoms is a really good starting point to begin to ask yourself the question whether you could be autistic, and use that to sort of jump into doing more research into the subject. You'll find details of my website here where you can access more resources, more information, and please like the channel, please subscribe. Thanks for listening.